My league start with cold damage over time in hardcore solo self-found heist league was a full success. If you like the idea of reducing the speed of everything around you and letting it die a slow and painful death, you should definitely give this super chill build a go. Hi guys, Catmaster here with another video. Today I want to give you an update on my VORTEX Occultist, which was basically the character that I started my league with. I mean, I did die once in Act 4 on the league start, but then afterwards I didn't die until I reached a 96.5 basically on this character, and it finally died to a crash because I wasn't holding back on heists as I probably should have. I was able to do most content without any problems at all on this character. I completed 20 Watchstones and I was going to do Cirrus, but I was still waiting for some upgrades that I wanted to get before I go into Cirrus. I also farmed countless high tier maps with Beyond and Crit and all kinds of mods and never really felt super threatened, which is mainly because the character was built very defensively, but also because I went for cold damage over time. Now the advantages for damage over time in general are that the damage sticks on the target or on the ground depending on the skill that you're using for a duration, which means that you don't have to stand still to apply your maximum DPS like you would have to in a, say, bow attacker or in a melee attacker build most of the time, but you can actually apply your degen and then reposition, use utility skills and whatnot while your damage still ticks. The total damage numbers on damage over time builds is in general a little bit lower to make up for that fact that maximum damage is up most of the time, that you have a higher uptime while still being able to do other things on the side. Another downside would be that you can't leech from damage over time. So you need to invest into other forms of recovery, such as life recovery on kill, on block, life regeneration, etc. A specific perk of cold damage over time versus other damage over time types is that skills that provide cold damage over time debuffs will apply chill. Chilled enemies have their action speed reduced. The action speed reduction per default in a chilling area is 10%. You can, however, increase the effect of chill by stacking increased ailment effect, or chill effect, or cold ailment effect. There's different phrasings on the tree. You can stack up to 200% increased effect of chill for a total of 30% reduced action speed. Now, because of that, the build was giving me a sort of sense of confidence, because no matter what happened around me, it was always slow enough that I was able to react, to reposition, and most of the time there was no real threat to the build because of that. Especially while heisting, I did the highest of heists with this. I did 83 heists. It was no problem. It was a breeze. There was some moments, obviously, where you're a little bit scared, especially when you roll your heists harder and you get a lot of extra damage on them. But generally speaking, this build was completely fine. Even though it didn't kill things immediately, you were always able to dash behind enemy lines and to just drop your cold damage over time, your chilling areas, and just let the enemies die while you walk away. Now, before we go into a detailed explanation of what I did and which decision I made where that finally led me to this state of the character, I want to quickly apologize for my long absence to the YouTube viewers. If you guys are unfamiliar, I do host a podcast which is called The Faded Connections together with Valor Mage, where we talk about all things PoE.
I think Harvest is the worst league they've ever done, ever.
So you didn't play Talisman then?
I would rather have Rampage.
This weekend we had Zizran and Pox as guests, and we talked a lot about the state of balance, about hardcore versus softcore, about heist in general, about items. So if you haven't checked that out, make sure you check on Spotify or any podcast audio platform of your choice, or you can also watch the upload of the video version on Valor Mage's YouTube. I also stream every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday at 4:20 p.m. Central European Time, twitch.tv/CatmasterOP. Make sure you say hi during the streams if you miss me during these times where I'm not able to upload new video content on YouTube. Now let's continue with the character, shall we? I'm quickly go over the perks or the features of this character at level 96.5, but please keep in mind that this is hardcore solo cell phone. I have to build defensively because I may not die, otherwise I lose the character, and I can only use gear that I find or craft myself, as trade is disabled in SSF. The character reached a total of about 700k dot Cirrus DPS, of which 580,000 cold dot DPS came from Vortex and about 135,000 from Cold Snap. Cold Snap's chilling areas reduce enemy action speed by 26%. I'm also running the Mind over Matter keystone, which makes you take 30% of the damage to mana before it's taken from life, which means that my 6,200 HP and my 2,300 mana make me reach approximately 8,500 EHP. It would be better to have like 2,600 mana, because when I get bursted down, my mana will be gone before my life will be gone. So what you say is my life is not fully covered by my mana for 30% Mind over Matter, but it's still a nice extension of your life pool. The character recovers 3% of life on kill, which is about 187 life. It's sitting at 76% all elemental resistance and is well overcapped for any resistance reduction curses. We're sitting at 75% chaos resist. We are stun immune from Occultist and immune to freeze and chill. On top of that, the character was able to stack 95% reduced effect of shock, which means that in the worst case scenario, a shock would increase damage taken by only 2.5%. Elemental ailment duration is also reduced by 45% on this character. Without glancing blows, while buffed from Tempest Shield, we're sitting at 53% chance to block attacks, 61% chance to block projectile attacks, and 40% chance to block spells. All in all, I consider this a well-balanced offense and defense character, a beefy character that's very consistent, and that's easy to outplay enemies with because of the 26% action speed reduction from chill. The downsides on this character I consider poor evasion, armor, and physical mitigation. The character has poor recovery outside of the on-kill effect, Flasks, and Enduring Cry, which are enough, but it's fair to say that other builds have better recovery options, and it has a relatively low mobility with very slow boss kills due to the relatively low damage. Now let's get into how the character works. Vortex is the main damage output that I run in a 6-link. Since it is an instant cast, it does have no cast time, it can be on the left mouse button. It does have a cooldown, but that cooldown is relatively low as well. As you can see in my build, it was 0.98 seconds only. So about every second while moving around, I drop one of these vortices, which, like I said, deal around 580,000 Cirrus DPS. The secondary skill in this build is Cold Snap, which serves as a clear, chill, and debuff skill. I stack the chill effect on Cold Snap up to, I think, 166%, and I was planning to get up to 196. Again, the cap is 200% increased effect of chill, and because we're using the Bone Chill support on Cold Snap, it makes enemies in the chilling areas more susceptible to cold damage over time. In order to further weaken the enemies and make them more susceptible to our damage, we're utilizing Elemental Equilibrium, as well as the lightning spells Tempest Shield and Orb of Storms, in order to debuff enemy cold resist by 50%. While Orb of Storms is self-cast for pressure situations and boss fight, Tempest Shield I used on a Trigger Scepter, which would automatically trigger Tempest Shield, Frostbite, and Frost Bomb periodically with a 4-second cooldown whenever I use my skills. Since we're using Mind over Matter, we may not reserve any of our mana without lowering our effective HP pool, which is why we decided to only run one reservation where we could have picked either Malevolence or Hatred. Now, Hatred has a little bit lower, more cold damage than Malevolence has more damage over time at the same level, and Hatred is lacking the increased skill effect duration that Malevolence provides. Hence, Malevolence is better. We're running it in an Essence Worm so that it doesn't reserve any mana. For mobility and defense, we're utilizing Flame Dash to dash around. We have a cast when damage taken Steel Skin to increase the EHP pool in pressure situations. And we're using Enduring Cry in order to gain endurance charges, as well as a short buff that regenerates a lot of life. I will quickly go over the specific gem setups that I'm using now. Our main skill, Vortex, is linked with Efficacy, which is the best damage over time support that there is for spell damage over time, because it has two separate more multipliers which both apply, but as more multipliers do not add up but multiply with each other, they result in a much bigger more multiplier than any other support gem that you could be using here. We're utilizing Elemental Focus, which provides a big more multiplier with the downside of not being able to inflict elemental ailments with the supported skill, which is completely unnecessary for me in this build. Now, Vortex and Cold Snap both do have a hit component where they hit with cold damage, and that cold damage hit could chill, but they also leave a chilling area which chills regardless of Elemental Focus or not. So while Elemental Focus takes the ability away to chill from the initial hit, the chilling area is unaffected by this, and we mostly just benefit from the huge more multiplier, and there's little to no downside in my build from Elemental Focus. I'm using Concentrated Effect. Now this is disputable. It's one of the best more multipliers, but it comes at the cost of AoE. So if you want more coverage, you could take this out, use a different support gem with just a more multiplier, or you could use increased AoE to even make your coverage bigger. But I found personally that while I'm clearing with Cold Snap most of the time anyway, that I don't need huge area on my Vortex because it's mostly used for bosses and for, you know, that one tanky rare in a pack. I'm using Swift Affliction, which reduces the duration a little bit, but grants a large more multiplier as well. And we're using Controlled Destruction, as critical strike chance is irrelevant on my main skill, and I just care about the more spell damage. For Cold Snap, we're using a Vile Cold Snap, by the way, because not only are we interested in the base Cold Snap, being able to leave a chilling area that will then increase cold damage taken by enemies in that chilling area and have massively reduced action speed. But also Vile Cold Snap is great as it allows you to generate frenzy charges on bosses. You get one frenzy charge every second if an enemy is in the skills area, and it also applies some damage on top of everything. And like I said, with cold damage over time or damage over time in general, damage numbers are relatively low, so you want to get all the stuff together that you can get. We're linking Vile Cold Snap with Hypothermia, which increases the chill effect massively, as well as Bone Chill, which is the gem that makes the enemies in the chilling areas take increased damage over time. If you're going for a purely debuff setup, you could use Increased Duration as the third support gem here. I opted for Efficacy. As I said earlier, Efficacy is the best spell damage over time support because of the two separate more multipliers which stack multiplicatively with each other, but also it grants skill effect duration, which just makes the Cold Snap last longer. As I explained, I'm using a Trigger Scepter. Trigger a socketed spell when you use a skill is insanely useful, but you need to unveil it via veiled items from June missions. That's a thing that you do once a league, and if you're in a trade league, you can also buy crafting services from other people where you can have that specific mod crafted onto your weapon. Tempest Shield, Frostbite, and Frostbomb is what I chose for this. Tempest Shield gives me block chance and hits enemies when I block with an arcing lightning damage hit, which then reduces their cold resist via elemental equilibrium. Frostbite is a curse, a hex as they're called now, that reduces enemy cold resist, which I prefer to automate instead of self-cast, but self-cast would be a little bit more powerful because of the new Doom mechanic, which makes curses gain effect the longer they are on an enemy, as long as they were self-cast. Last but not least, we're putting Frost Bomb on this trigger, which applies cold exposure for another minus 25% cold resistance. Very, very good. But again, my choice to put that on automation, as you don't really need it most of the time. You really want to just kick that out when there's a boss or a really tanky rare. But most of the time you don't need it. However, I just like low brain maintenance gameplay because I'm constantly multitasking, monitoring my stream, monitoring the stream chat, and it's just easier for me, mental maintenance, to just, you know, just press 1 or 2 buttons and have everything else go off automatically. And I'm sure if you try it yourself, you'll find the same thing, because most of the time PoE gets a lot easier if you can focus your attention on just 1 or 2 aspects of the build. I'm using Flame Dash with faster casting in order to gain Arcane Surge. I could have probably adjusted the level of this Arcane Surge. You don't need a level 1, as my mana cost for Flame Dash is 31 and Arcane Surge only requires you to spend a total of 15 to proc, so you could probably go to like level 5, 6, I don't know the exact values, but you get the gist. Don't just use a level 1, but it's low thinking, right? Easy. And in order to benefit from both faster casting and the Arcane Surge support, we're also putting our Orb of Storms in here. Faster casting makes it so you can drop it incredibly fast, and it's just really, really nice. My Warcry, Enduring Cry, which grants a large amount of life regeneration over 1 second, basically a health flask without expending flask charges, and allows you to gain endurance charges per power of enemies. Warcries were changed to be based on power, and Enduring Cry does not generate any endurance charges if there's no enemies in range. However, there doesn't need to be any enemy in range for the regen. So whenever you Warcry, you just get this 2000 life over 1 second, which is like a potion basically. So what I'm doing is I link it with increased duration so that the duration of the buff lasts longer, which doesn't affect the life regen as far as I'm aware, but it does affect the buff that grants you bonus all elemental resistances and physical damage reduction per endurance charge. When you have your 3 endurance charges up, which is by default your maximum, and I didn't go out of my way in this build to raise my maximum endurance charges, then you gain 6 all res and 6% physical damage reduction, which is really what matters. I'm already overcapped on resistances, but getting another 6% physical damage reduction on top of 3 times 4 from the 3 endurance charges is a total of 18% physical damage reduction, which is really nice. Linking that also with Second Wind, which makes non-instant skills have +1 cooldown use and increased cooldown recovery rate, meaning that the Warcry comes off cooldown only after 6.45 seconds, and I can use it an additional time, meaning that you can use it and always have another use in your hand for when you need it while the first cooldown recovers. That's just why I really like Second Wind. It's not really about the cooldown recovery or being able to use it an additional time before it goes on cooldown, but the fact that it already goes on cooldown when you just used it once, so you always have the security, basically, the insurance that you can use it an additional time if necessary while it recovers the cooldown, which is just, for me as a hardcore player, it's worth a lot. Last but not least, I actually dedicated an entire 4-link to cast when damage taken Steel Skin. I'm linking it with efficacy and increased duration. When Steel Skin goes off, it gives me a buff that lasts for 3.15 seconds, and in this time the buff can take up to 2209 damage. 70% of the damage from hits is taken from this 2209 buff before it's taken from my life or energy shield. Now, it's really disputable whether it's worth it to 4-link a cast when damage taken guard skill setup, but for me personally, I didn't feel like I had anything else that I wanted to run. Same with the 3-link Warcry, I just really value Second Wind on Enduring Cry. Increased duration is not necessarily needed, but it does help. And in the same way with Steel Skin, I just like to have the buff last as long as possible, because sometimes you take 3272 damage, it triggers and the buff is up, and then you don't take any damage, and then you walk into the pack again, and then you take the damage. So you kind of want the buff to last, so that between it being automatically triggered and you actually making use of the buff, needing the buff, you know, you have a big window rather than a small window where it gets triggered, you're not taking the damage, the buff duration ends, and then you're taking damage and then you die, right? That's basically my train of thought here, but I'm aware that it's a kind of waste of a 4-link and of a 3-link, but I didn't feel like I need more in this build. But if I do it again, I may do this differently, and you should feel free to make an informed decision here and do it differently as well, because this is not optimal, it just works really well for me and my playstyle. Now, in terms of gear, what I would recommend for the helmet, you use a Rhyme Gaze, which is a unique helmet that grants you cold damage over time multiplier. Rhyme Gaze does reduce your energy shield recharge rate, which is something to look out for in builds that are based on energy shield. However, because we're Mind Over Matter, pure life, it doesn't really matter too much. So you can use Rhyme Gaze until you get a good rare, and that's pretty long. I, however, didn't find a Rhyme Gaze, so I used a rare from the start relatively early, where I just prioritized life, mana, and resists. You should prioritize life and mana on every item where possible as a Mind Over Matter build in order to get enough mana to cover your life and to get as big a life pool as possible. Now on this particular item I was able to craft another prefix, and I went for +1 level of socketed AoE gems and 10% increased area of effect. The +1 only applies to the gem that is linked and socketed in this helmet, so it gets a +1, the Val Cold Snap. Increased area of effect is a global stat that increases all the area of the character, so very good craft on the helmet. On the weapon, we went for +1 all cold spell skill gems, which, pay attention to the word all, this affects all skill gems in the build, which is why it says +1 level from global modifiers on the Val Cold Snap and on the Vortex here. This just raises the level of all cold spell skill gems by 1, so very good value in the build, because we're using a lot of cold spells, right? We're using Frost Bomb as well, we're using Frostbite, all of these benefit from the levels. You want to prioritize +1 all cold spell skill gems and cold dot multiplier on your weapon. But increased spell damage, increased cold damage are also really good. What mostly matters on your weapon for a cold damage over time build, or in general for a spellcaster build, is you want to have a free suffix so you can trigger a socketed spell when you use a skill. The only mandatory unique item in the build is Essence Worm, which you can buy relatively cheap in trade leagues, and it's also common enough to be able to find it in SSF eventually. Sometimes you just won't find it, but I found one really early on, which kind of inspired the decision to go Mind Over Matter. Early on I was planning to maybe go Chaos Inoculation early, but because we found the Essence Worm, we knew we can reserve 1 aura without reserving any mana, and that means we can use all the other mana to artificially inflate our life pool. The downside of Essence Worm, obviously, is that it comes with pretty much no stats other than that, and it even has the downside of increasing your mana reservation outside of the 1 aura that you're running in the ring, which means you really don't want to run any other auras. For the shield, I decided for Lionized Remorse, which is probably not the best choice, but it does have a really good amount of block, and it gives you a ton of life. You can have up to 180 explicitly and up to 30 implicitly, which means this shield can have up to 210 flat life. If I take this shield off, you can see my life go down from 6,200 to 5,600. So this shield makes a difference of around 600 life in my build. Pretty good and very hard to beat by a rare, but my plan was to replace this shield eventually with a Shaper or Warlord's shield that would grant life recovery on block. But you need to craft those, and they don't only have to have that specific mod, but you also want good other values, you want good flat life, you want good resists if possible. So We opted for Lionize, it was really good. But it's not necessary, it's just my choice, it's not something that I would recommend you use in this build or that I would recommend you target farm when you're in SSF, even though you can target farm it fairly easily by farming the Lion cards in Act 6 Mudflats, which I do recommend you complete a set every time you level the character in SSF, because that's at a point in the act progression where you can really use some additional levels, and farming 5 cards is not very hard. The shield is just one of the possible outcomes when you trade 5 the Lion cards for a Lionize item, but the other ones aren't complete garbage and generally good value, so it's recommended. You have a high chance to get the shield or the chest piece, which are good, and that's why I complete this set in solo self-found if possible. All the other rares in the build are what I said earlier: life, mana, and resists. Now with priority on life and getting the resist cap, and where possible I also try to get a little bit of chaos resistance in order to bring my chaos resist to cap. Double resist crafts with cold and chaos, or fire and chaos, or lightning and chaos are really valuable here and go a long way to getting your chaos resist up, which is very recommendable nowadays. I'm using 2 unique jewels in this build. We got Spirited Response, which is the Warcry Threshold jewel. You need to socket this in a socket with at least 40 int in radius, but the intelligence does not need to be allocated to count towards this threshold. When you have it socketed in a socket like that fulfills the requirement, it grants 10% of damage taken, gained as mana over 4 seconds when hit, as long as you walk right recently. Another good reason to have Enduring Cry on second wind, so we can use it frequently. Recently in Path of Exile is always 4 seconds. So when I get hit for, say, 1,000 damage, then I gain 100 mana over 4 seconds, which is 25 mana per second for 4 seconds. Pretty useful in order to fill back up your mana in combat situations where you do take a lot of damage. And then we also have Anatomical Knowledge, which gives flat life per intelligence allocated in radius. This also justified to refund out of the spell damage here and to get the intelligence nodes here, which saves me a couple of points, which makes it easier to get a cluster jewel region into the build, and also, you know, gives me life via Anatomical Knowledge. As you can see, this jewel gives me flat 30 life and 8% increased max life. Very, very good. If I take it out, I lose like 250 life easily. Very, very helpful. This Opal ring I crafted with an Essence of Hatred to guarantee the increased cold damage. So you can see that between the 30% increased elemental damage and the explicit 34 increased cold damage, this is a 64% increased damage ring for my build. The intelligence fuels into the mana, because as we all know, 2 intelligence in a build gives you 1 flat mana. And the chaos resist was just the icing on top. Now, sadly, it didn't have a life roll, so I had to craft life, but crafted life is good enough. The difference between crafted life on a ring and perfect explicit rolled life, which would be, I think, 79, is only about 24 or 25 in this case. So that's a fair price to pay, in my opinion, for the other excellent stats on this ring. As usual, a Stygian Vise for the socket, getting additional life and other values in here. Now, until you get a Stygian Vise base, you can just use a leather belt, which also has up to 40 life implicit, but getting a socket and being able to put a jewel like this in is obviously much more value than just 40 life, because this could have up to 40 life if it had a tier 1 roll as well. And it has 3 other stats, so definitely the best belt base in the game still. This is the tree of the build at level 96. It focuses largely on life, mana, a little bit of spell block and block, as well as ailment effect reduction, and a bare minimum of damage scaling from the tree. We gave up almost all damage scaling from the tree when we picked up our cluster, but I didn't get into cluster jewels before I was level 94, I believe. Before cluster jewels, we're using a different version of the tree. I will make sure to include both the version without cluster jewel and with cluster jewel at level 96 each. Keep in mind that the tree is pretty optimized for its state. If you're leveling, you would of course make different choices. If you choose to level this build, I personally would recommend that you play with AWP of Storms and Stormblast Mine until Act 3, where you can pick up Vortex from the reward for killing General Gravicious and a bunch of other useful gems from the library quest. You should path out of the Witch through the spell damage and make your way to Elemental Overload as fast as possible. If you choose to go dual wielding while leveling for maximum damage, you should also pick up the dual wield cluster Dark Arts. You can then make your way to the Templar start and pick up life as well as elemental resistances, damage, and more life. If you need help early on capping out your resists, you can pick up the Walker nodes at the Witch start. Later, when you stop dual wielding, you should of course refund out of the Dark Arts cluster and invest the points elsewhere. You may use the same tree to level with Creeping Frost instead. If you don't want to level with AWP of Storms and want to get the cold damage over time experience right off the start, you may do so as soon as you reach level 12. After you reach Merville's Caverns, you can pick up Wintertide Brand as well as Creeping Frost from the vendor. Despite the fact that early on you don't have good support gems to support damage over time skills, these can be used to level, although I would not recommend to do so over AWP of Storms because it's just much better. While leveling through the game, I went for Void Beacon in my first lab, I went for Frigid Wake in my second lab, and for Vile Bastion in my third lab. Void Beacon and Frigid Wake are just bread and butter for damage, and the cannot be chilled, cannot be frozen is very valuable, as well as the situational every 4 seconds freeze, which is guaranteed on non-unique enemies. Very powerful, something that you also really take for granted while you're playing the build, but then when you're not playing it, you start to miss it. Nearby chilled enemies deal 10% reduced damage with hits, not to be underestimated. Really good. For Uber Lab, I went for Withering Presence solely for the chaos resistance. Now if you have better gear and you are able to reach the chaos resistance cap without Withering Presence, I would definitely go for Profane Bloom, because Profane Bloom takes away the problem that hexproof enemies are a lot more tanky and hexproof maps are a little bit of a problem because they just can't be cursed with the Frostbite for resist reduction. And the Profane Bloom explosions with a 25% chance to explode on cursed enemies, despite not scaling chaos damage, will still massively help you clear. But I do prioritize Withering Presence. Why I'm not getting Withering Presence in Merciless Lab and Vile Bastion in Uber Lab is because I hate getting stunned. Getting stunned can mean the death of your character because you'll fail to reposition. And Vile Bastion makes you unable to be stunned while you have Energy Shield, which even in a build that doesn't have a lot of Energy Shield like this one, you'll have Energy Shield while clearing all the time because you regenerate 1% of Energy Shield per second for each enemy you or your minions have killed recently, up to 10%, and on top of that you get a 40 Energy Shield per second back, which means unless you're affected by a strong degen that takes away all your Energy Shield and prevents it from regenerating, you're stun immune all the time. Very value, in my opinion. But you could, like I said, go for the Profane Bloom and Malediction route. Malediction gives you +1 curse, which would allow you to use Elemental Weakness on top for further resist reduction, and also scales the effectiveness of your curses, and further reduces the damage that enemies deal, and increases the damage that they take. So if you have better gear, if you're a low life build with Presence of Chiula, so you get your stun immunity from the amulet, and you already have your chaos resist capped, you don't need Withering Presence, I would definitely go for Profane Bloom and Malediction, even though in a low life build the regen would be very good to have. There's other ways to recover Energy Shield, so Malediction seems really strong. For the Cluster Jewel region, we went for a large cold damage Cluster Jewel, on which we rolled Cold-Blooded Killer for the recovery on killing a chilled enemy and Cold damage over time multiplier, which is the priority stat on tree and gear for cold damage over time builds, as well as deep chill, again cold damage over time multiplier. Using a medium cold damage over time jewel, which we rolled with Brush with Death and Deep Chill. Brush with Death recovers 1% of life and 1% of energy shield on kill and grants 10% damage over time multiplier. Deep Chill, the same passive that we already have here, another 10% cold damage over time multiplier, and importantly 30% increased effect of cold ailments, which makes the action speed reduction by our chilling areas much larger. And then we also socketed a life jewel with Fettle, which is a lot of life. And on the other side, we're using a spell block jewel with Flexible Sentry. This grants not only flat chance to block spell damage and to block attack damage, but it also reduces ailment duration on me, and it reduces the effect of non-damaging ailments, which also contributes to the aforementioned 95% reduced effect of shock on this character, which makes it virtually immune to shock. Almost, right? So I don't need a shock remove flask. Now, the large cold is pretty much the best that you can get. If you are CI or low life, you can possibly go for spell damage on the large cluster jewel. Spell damage large cluster jewels don't have any damage over time multiplier notables, but they do come with additional spell block notables that they can roll. The medium is undoubtedly the best if you go for a cold damage over time multiplier, but a regular damage over time will work as well. Make sure to check out PoEDB to see exactly what you can roll and how you roll it. For the small cluster jewels, it really depends on your build. In a life build, you probably want to go for life or block like I did, but you could also go for a mana jewel if you feel that that helps you a lot, or you could go for chaos res if you're not chaos res capped, or if you're chaos inoculation or low life, you could also go for an energy shield small jewel. Going for a single cluster jewel region with a large, 2 medium and 2 small is also something that I realized is not something that everyone does. Other people have socketed just a medium and a small here and go for just a medium and a small here. There's different approaches always. This is probably better in a CI build where you want to go through the int out here and not pick the chaos res and life here anyway. For me personally, it felt more point efficient to squeeze it all into this region and to not path up here to get this one. In the remaining 4 levels that we would have still gotten, we would have been able to put in another medium cold dot multi here to max out the damage. For my flask setup in this build, I went for a Seething Divine Life Flask of Staunching. Every build wants a Staunching Flask. On most builds you can get away with putting Staunching on your instant Life Flask, but you have to be aware that this doesn't grant immunity to bleeding during effect because the flask doesn't have any effect duration as it's all instant recovery. I did have a jewel with Corrupted Blood immunity for this build ready, so I didn't need anything else than a on point bleed remove in case I get hit by a large puncture or something while I'm cursed with vulnerability. I use the Quartz Flask because that makes you phase, which allows you to run through packs and enemies without unit collision. This is really, really valuable, and I almost run it on every build, specifically on damage over time builds though, because when you deal damage over time, you're not instantly killing things, but you're applying the debuff, and then they will slowly die, and in that time you may want to just walk away, and you don't want to get stuck in the middle of the pack. Curse immunity, because that's something that you really need in any build. You don't want to be cursed with any curse. You always want to have curse immunity up if possible. We're using Experimenter's Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline, high duration, movement speed buff. Could be better rolled, but that's what I had at the time. We're using a Granite Flask of Iron Skin, which increases the armor massively. My armor goes up from around 3,000 to 11,500 during this flask. Now you could use a Basalt Flask if you're doing lab content or boss content, because that will provide a larger amount of fizz reduction as the physical reduction granted by armor largely depends on the ratio between your armor and the incoming hit, and at large incoming hits, armor becomes pretty useless versus physical reduction percentage based, which we get from Enduring Cry, and that would stack nicely with the Basalt Flask, but at the moment not. And then we're using an Enduring Eternal Mana Flask of Curing. Of Curing is immunity to poison, removes poison on use, and Enduring Mana Flask means that the flask effect does not end when you're at full mana, but it goes through for the entire duration, which means if I lose a little bit of mana, I use the mana flask, I cap out again and I lose a lot of mana, the flask recovery will still work. Now, normally I would want freeze and chill remove, I would want shock remove on my flask setup, but as I said earlier, we got freeze and chill remove, immunity even, from the Occultist Ascendancy, and we stack up reduced effect of non-damaging ailments on you via several notables, so that we end up at a total of 95%, meaning that we don't really need a shock remove flask in this build. For the Bandits, as usual, I helped Alira at first, because Alira grants you mana regeneration and elemental resistances. As soon as you're in endgame and your gear is better, you can then use the recipe with 20 regret orbs and an onyx amulet that you sell to the vendor in order to get a Book of Regression, which will then grant you Aramir's Favor, which is the 2 passive points. I recommend always help Alira early on if you can afford to refund it later. If you have good leveling gear, you may directly skip Alira, but you will definitely notice the 15% aura res that you're missing, as well as the 5 flat mana regen, because that does really make a big difference while leveling. A lot of good items have high level requirements, so you can't use them early on. That's why I usually prefer to just get Alira early and then refund later when I can use all my good gear with all the good resists. So that means we already arrived at the final chapter of this video. We already went over a couple of those, but for the last section in this video, I want to quickly talk about possible upgrades for the build. What would I have done if the character wouldn't have died at 96 and I would have been able to get more stuff? Quality on gems is very obvious. As you probably saw, not all of my gems are fully qualityed and fully flipped because I optimized the gem setup before I died and I didn't have time to apply quality. Now obviously I would have enough GCP to just quality it up straight to 20%, but I didn't at the time, and that's definitely something that would still make a difference and would be relatively easy to achieve. Also, better mana on rare items, for example temple mana items with the hybrid mod flat mana and increased mana would have been really good to get my mana pool to the point where it's fully covering my life, although I never ran into the problem that I ran out of mana and I still did have life. That was never a thing. Better chaos resist on rares is something that I already mentioned briefly, because with better chaos resist on all items, see on the chest piece maybe and on the helmet, maybe also another roll on the boots, we would have been able to spec out of Withering Presence in the Ascendancy, which we solely picked for the 60% increased chaos damage, and would replace it with Profane Bloom, which allows us to curse hexproof enemies and gives us a little bit of an explosion for better clear. Another upgrade would have been the second medium cold dot cluster that I was talking about. That would have gone in between the large and the small here if we had more points. Chill effect would have been raised to 29%, and if it was the same cluster as this one, Rush with Death and Deep Chill, it would probably go around 16.5% more damage on the entire build as well. Now, if you're in Trade League or if you're an avid Cirrus killer, you could also use the awakened versions of Elemental Focus, Swift Affliction, and Controlled Destruction. Each one of those awakened versions of the gems are around 10 to 15% more damage in the build than the regular version. If we could get an additional curse, either from an Amulet Corruption or Whispers of Doom in the tree, which is relatively close now over here, then we could use either Temp Chains for further slow, which multiplicatively scales with the slow from Chill effect, And Elemental Weakness would have been the damage option instead. We could have used Elemental Weakness for another 10% more damage via resist reduction. Also, if we were able to squeeze in an additional aura by either giving up Mind Over Matter or using a second Essence Worm instead of this ring, then Hatred would have provided a whopping 19% more damage to the build. And last but not least, what I already mentioned, replacing the shield with a Shaper or Warlord shield with the explicit life gain on block mod would have been really good in order to make sure that the survivability is given when a lot of enemies attack you at the same time. Now that sums it up so far. If you have any questions about the build at all, leave them in the comments down below or visit the stream at twitch.tv/CatmasterOP. As I said, every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday, 4:20 Central European time, usually for 8 hours or longer, so you should be able to tune in regardless of where on the globe you currently are. Make sure to check out the Faded Connections podcast with Balor Mage. There's also a link in the description below. If you enjoyed this sort of videos, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and you ring the bell so you get notified whenever I upload new content. Thank you all for watching, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in Heist. Also, better mana on rare items, for example temple mana items with the hybrid mod flat mana and increased mana would have been really good to get my mana pool to the point where it's fully covering my life, although I never ran into the problem that I ran out of mana and I still did have life. That was never a thing. Better chaos resist on rares is something that I already mentioned briefly, because with better chaos resist on all items, see on the chest piece maybe and on the helmet, maybe also another roll on the boots, we would have been able to spec out of Withering Presence in the Ascendancy, which we solely picked for the 60% increased chaos damage, and would replace it with Profane Bloom, which allows us to curse hexproof enemies and gives us a little bit of an explosion for better clear. Another upgrade would have been the second medium cold dot cluster that I was talking about. That would have gone in between the large and the small here if we had more points. Chill effect would have been raised to 29%, and if it was the same cluster as this one with Brush with Death and Deep Chill, it would probably go around 16.5% more damage on the entire build as well. Now, if you're in Trade League or if you're an avid Cirrus killer, you could also use the awakened versions of Elemental Focus, Swift Affliction, and Controlled Destruction. Each one of those awakened versions of the gems are around 10 to 15% more damage in the build than the regular version. If we could get an additional curse, either from an Amulet Corruption or Whispers of Doom in the tree, which is relatively close now over here, then we could use either Temp Chains for further slow, which multiplicatively scales with the slow from Chill effect. And Elemental Weakness would have been the damage option instead. We could have used Elemental Weakness for another 10% more damage via resist reduction. Also, if we were able to squeeze in an additional aura by either giving up Mind Over Matter or using a second Essence Worm instead of this ring, then Hatred would have provided a whopping 19% more damage to the build. And last but not least, what I already mentioned, replacing the shield with a Shaper or Warlord shield with the explicit life gain on block mod would have been really good in order to make sure that the survivability is given when a lot of enemies attack you at the same time. Now that sums it up so far. If you have any questions about the build at all, leave them in the comments down below or visit the stream at twitch.tv/CatmasterOP. As I said, every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday, 4:20 Central European time, usually for 8 hours or longer, so you should be able to tune in regardless of where on the globe you currently are. Make sure to check out the Faded Connections podcast with Balor Mage. There's also a link in the description below. If you enjoyed this sort of videos, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and you ring the bell so you get notified whenever I upload new content. Thank you all for watching, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in Heist.